Man, this thing's looking so pretty.
It's getting there, isn't it?
Only if you had a freaking engine, dude.
Hang on one sec.
What? What? You ain't got an engine down there, sure. Oh my god!
It's so light.
Welcome to Mint Customs.
So the engine arrived on a crate. I was super excited. So from one company I bought the engine, carburetor, wiring loom, exhaust can, and the clutch master cylinder.
Oh.
So basically I got a full package, a full running kit for the rolling chassis that I'd already built. And if you've watched the other two episodes, you'll know that we're making a whole series purely on this one build, and we're going into a lot more detail. So in the last two episodes, the first episode was designing the bike, getting the bike designed, doing the research, figuring out what parts I was going to need, figuring out what parts I needed to make. The second episode was building the rolling chassis, so building the suspension. I made the shock from scratch, got the frame, built the subframe, got the seat. I've had massive troubles with the fuel tank, which we'll go into later in this episode. Got the rolling chassis built, the front calipers needed machining, the discs needed offsetting, I made wheel spacers, and everything was custom made for this bike. Nothing fits, everything's needed work, everything has needed hours of
Painstaking.
everything has needed hours basically to get the bike built. And then the next hurdle after making the rolling chassis was getting hold of the exact engine I needed for this build, and that's taken a year. Not only is it really hard to find the engine, but when we did find the engine, it's super expensive. So we got the engine onto the bench. It does need a lot of work, and it is very dirty. It needs, probably gonna give it a full rebuild. Crank, piston, cylinder, the lot.
Yeah.
I'm crossing my fingers that the clutch is in good condition and we don't have to spend loads of money on the clutch as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we have an engine, so we can use this to mock it up, get it in the frame, make engine mounts for it, make an exhaust system for it. I might even run it as it is because it is a runner. And the first thing that was very clear was we were going to have to do some severe frame modifications to get this engine into the chassis. But the first job is lining up the sprocket, getting the engine centered in the middle of the frame and making engine mounts for it, and getting the sprocket as close as possible to the swing arm pivot so the bike still handles, goes around corners, and it still has a basic setup for anti-squat and everything when you accelerate out of corners.
Is it a 300? What's the
Yeah,
tube?
so at the minute this is a KTM EXC 250 engine,
Okay.
but they do a conversion kit to 300.
Perfect.
So when we rebuild this motor, we'll turn it into a 300 EXC engine.
Okay. Sounds wicked.
Sound like a plan?
Yeah, man.
Let's do this. That runs the whole bike.
Blimey.
I mean, the CDI unit plugs in there.
Yeah.
That's a lighting. I'm guessing that's a lighting circuit
Lights out.
with a horn,
Coil.
coil, HT lead, and a kill switch. What more do you need?
You don't.
We'll have to run a GPS speedo on it or something.
Yeah.
CDI unit. But when we change it into a 300, we'll get a new one of them with the kit.
Cool. Ooh.
DID chain.
Nice.
And an end can,
Okay.
because it was in the deal,
Yeah.
and
Use it on mock-up.
we could
Test
make
it.
a dummy system out of the original EXC pipe.
Yeah.
I've got the down pipe down there, and we could cut and shut a dummy system just to get the right line,
Mm-hmm.
and then get Hot Rod Tom to TIG weld it all up. Or we'll have, once we have the design, we can make a whole one from scratch and make it pretty. So I thought it was worth grabbing that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
From what I can work out, the coolant hoses, the radiator and the motor are the same.
Okay.
OD.
Just out there, I'm guessing.
I'm guessing that's out and that gravity fed in.
Yeah.
But that out can go to that rad mount,
Yep.
this side, and then that in can come from the other side.
First step then, you're going to clean it up?
Yeah, I've got to clean it really, before I even get started.
What's going on with the engine?
Okay, so I've offered the engine into the frame.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be a little bit more complicated than we originally thought. Because, well, they've got this back engine mount here. And that's got to go on the swing arm mount, so we have to cut this tube out and replace that with the engine.
So it slots in.
Yeah, and then we have to get the offset right, so we get our sprocket alignment with the rear wheel. Which is okay, I'm cool with that. We kind of knew we're going to have to do that. The issue we got is around the other side, the kickstart and the kickstart housing comes in contact with the frame.
Oh,
So
yeah.
the higher we lift the motor, the more
Yeah.
this comes in contact. So I think we might have to remove this part of the frame and angle it in a different direction because of the kickstart, which I wasn't planning on doing. Bearing in mind I wanted to get a modern engine that was electric start, which would have eliminated this problem, but the fact we've actually got an older engine with a kickstart is giving us this massive issue of having to cut the frame away to get the kickstart mechanism in place. So we managed to get the rear engine mount through the swing arm pivot and get the sprocket lined up. Then the next challenge was getting the front engine mount in place and making sure the carburettor is going to fit inside the frame. And at this point, we realised we were going to have to cut a big chunk of the frame out to get the kickstart mechanism in.
How'd you get around that?
Well, I measured the frame and angle grinded a big chunk of the frame out and then promised Katie, the KTM, that I would rebuild her and make the frame stronger and better quality than it was originally. Bearing in mind we've done some serious modifications on this frame already, but it still was a little worrying cutting like a main part of the frame out. Okay, so I've had a few days of not filming because I've been focused on getting this thing in the frame. So I've made up these engine mounts. I've got the top engine mount there. The rear of the motor goes through the swing arm. And then we've got this front engine mount here, which is all worked out pretty well. You can see where the exhaust is going to go, and I have the expansion chamber for the pipe under here. Got the clutch on, got the chain in place, got the rough setup for the rear sets and the gear changer. Probably going to make a nicer version of this bracket once I know it's working good. I've had to make an inlet for the carb because the original inlet didn't fit with the frame. Then I took a minute just to check the clutch, check compression, check the engine, because although we're going to completely rebuild this engine with a new cylinder, new piston, new crank, new everything, it's basically going to be a brand new engine. We wanted to run the engine as it is now to make sure the wiring loom works, make sure the frame is correct and we don't have to do any modifications before we send it for powder coat. So once all the engine mounts are in, the radiator went on, we got coolant hoses in place.
Exhaust.
Yeah, me and Tom put the wiring loom on and we were getting very close to running the bike. The last thing we had to do to actually get this bike running and to test everything was to make an exhaust system. Like everything on this bike has been overly complicated and taken way too much work to get things to fit. The exhaust is no exception. We had to measure the whole original exhaust system to make sure we get the optimum tuned length and we get the expansion chamber for the pipe in the right place, so this engine runs correctly. So along with getting the carburetor set up, we also have to get the exhaust set up so this two-stroke engine runs perfectly. And so now we have the exhaust in place. There's a little bit of welding to do, but we think it's going to work and we think it's going to perform okay, but we won't know exactly until we actually ride this bike or take it for a dyno test. But it's getting close, as you can see. Got the rear brake in place. We've got a temperature gauge on the radiator so we can test how hot or cold the engine is, because that's obviously not the original radiator. They put a different radiator on it for the chassis, so it'll be interesting to see the temperature when this bike gets up and running. We might have to run some tape on the radiator.
And the fuel tank, oh mama, is complete. Could have welded on that. Isn't that just beautiful?
So the fuel tank, we'll just talk about the fuel tank for a moment. We spoke to our friend Stuart, who does a lot of fabrication work for us, and he makes brackets for the old man and his Harleys, and he makes the seat pans and bits and pieces for us. Super handy guy to know. He walked in the workshop and saw that I was making an aluminium fuel tank from scratch for this bike, because I went through 20, maybe 30 fuel tanks trying to find a tank that worked with this bike, and I wasn't happy with any of them. So I decided to make one from scratch out of aluminium. And he walked in just as I was putting in one of the last panels, and he said to me, "Who's going to weld that up for you?" And I was thinking, because I've been learning how to aluminium weld, I thought I would take on the task. But I was a little bit worried, because welding up an aluminium fuel tank is quite complicated and probably one of the hardest things you can do.
Serious skill
when it comes to welding. So he offered to weld it up for me, and there was one side of me that thought it'd be so nice for me to not only make the tank but weld it up myself, so I can say that I've made it completely by myself. But I was also realistic, and I knew that I wasn't that good at alley welding, and it would be better if I got a professional to do it for me. So thanks Stuart for welding up my fuel tank. It looks absolutely awesome, and I just hope it doesn't leak. I'm sure it'll be fine.
Yeah.
You see two-stroke and fuel pissing out the bottom of it.
It's not always going to look like that. It's going to have a cover, right?
Yeah.
Technically, it's a fuel cell, not a fuel tank.
Yeah, it is a fuel cell, because me and Tom, if you remember from another episode, Tom got very handy with fiberglass.
Yay!
And he turns out he's actually really good with bodywork, and he can make really cool stuff out of fiberglass. So we're gonna make a cover for this tank. Well, there's two reasons why we need a cover for it. One is because I'm gonna be riding it, and the rider needs something to grab hold of, and the fuel cell isn't really big enough and isn't the right shape for a rider to be able to use his knees on the side of the tank to turn the bike through the corners. So one of the reasons why we're making a cover is so it's more comfortable for the rider, and it's easier for the rider to go around corners.
And it'll look more like a finished project.
Yeah. And the second reason is it'll be more of a finished project. We can have it painted, which means we can leave the aluminium as it is, and we can polish it, or do a brushed finish on the aluminium, and then have a cover over the top which is painted with our logos and stuff on it. And then at shows and stuff, we can lift the cover up and show the fuel cell underneath the cover.
That sounds wicked.
We need it to blend in a little bit better with the seat unit, the
Needs
KTM
flow.
seat unit. Yeah, it needs to flow together, and it will look a lot nicer. I know it looks quite finished at the moment, but there is still a lot of little jobs to do.
Still got to finish the pipe.
Finish the pipe, the end cam's got to be sorted, brakes have got to be let up. Basically, we want to get it to the point where it runs, and then
Fully
we're going to do
functional.
some tests on it. Then we'll completely strip it, have the frame powder coated, have the bodywork painted, and then it'll be like,
Save up some pennies.
yeah, we need to, I mean, it's been an absolute money pit, this bike. Like, it's literally cost me thousands to get to this point. So it's got to be done right. And I know it might seem silly to build it once and run it and then completely strip it and rebuild it again, but I'd rather do it that way, and then we know it's absolutely perfect, and the second time it's completely built, it will be the real finished product, and it will basically be a brand new version of what it is now. At the end of this series, I am actually going to do a breakdown of everything on this bike and what it's cost. So you will know exactly how much this bike has cost me and how much time I put into it, and well, I was going to say how much I was going to sell it for, but this bike is not being sold. And you'll know if you watch any of the other videos how sad we are when we actually have to sell one of the bikes. But we're keeping hold of this one, and we're going to be testing it, we're going to be taking it on track days, we're going to be riding it, and we're going to film everything and document the whole thing. How much do you reckon it's going to cost, Tom?
Well, already it's cost, I don't even want to say.